Welcome to Is It the Podcast? From Rembrandt to Rubens, from Van Dyck to Van Eyck, each episode examines an artwork with an uncertain authorship, in dialogue with a leading guest expert. We'll tell the story of the artist we suspect created the work, of the work in question, and then we reveal the results of a cutting-edge AI authentication analysis performed by the Swiss firm Art Recognition. I'm your host, Professor Noah Charney. So, is it? When we think of the greats, true titans of Western art, one name always echoes through the galleries and the textbooks: Rembrandt van Rijn. He is our subject, but my discussion with our guest expert was so packed with goodness that we've made 2 episodes out of it. In this, the first episode, we talk about connoisseurship and how art is authenticated. In the second, we dive deeper into the Rembrandt painting in question. Rembrandt was born in 1606 in the bustling university town of Leiden, the 9th child of a hard-working miller whose windmill stood at the edge of the old city ramparts, its sails turning steadily above the flat Dutch landscape. And despite his humble origins, Rembrandt showed an early artistic promise. By his teens, he was apprenticed to local painters, later studying in Amsterdam, and then returning briefly to Leiden to open his first workshop. By his early 20s, he was already captivating Amsterdam's elite with portraits unlike anything they had seen before. What made Rembrandt singular was not his ability to flatter or idealize, as many of his peers did, but his insistence on truth. He painted people as they were, not as they wished to be. With wrinkles, scars, sallow skin, sagging flesh, he saw beauty in every human imperfection. In an age of rising wealth and vanity, he dared to show sorrow, frailty, solitude. His genius lay in his fearless honesty, his reverence for the dignity of the flawed, fragile people. With Rembrandt, a portrait was never just a picture. It was a revelation. He painted biblical scenes not with grandeur but with gritty humanity. His Night Watch, for instance, isn't a stiff parade of military figures. It's a living, chaotic, cinematic moment. His self-portraits, over 80 of them, chronicle his life like visual memoirs, from ambitious youth to weary old age, all lit with his signature chiaroscuro, that dramatic dance between light and dark. But for all his brilliance, Rembrandt is also one of the most contested figures in art history. That's because few artists have had more works attributed to them and then more stripped away than he has. At one time, more than 600 paintings bore his name, along with around 1,400 drawings and 300 etchings. Now, closer to 300 paintings. The others, say some scholars, were painted by students, assistants, or followers from his bustling workshop. But even 300 is a large number for a painter to create. It roughly matches the number produced by Van Dyck, with some 200 attributed to Frans Hals over his career, and only around 35 to Vermeer. We'll leave Rubens aside for a different episode, as he's had over 1,400 paintings attributed to him, but he's famously problematic in terms of attribution. Suffice to say that Rembrandt was prolific. But was he the mastermind behind every brushstroke? Such questions have led to decades of detective work by art historians and connoisseurs, and they take us to the heart of what it means to be an artist and how we define authorship in art at all. Today's guest knows exactly how to dig into that question and explode it in the best possible way. Blake Gopnik is not just an art critic. He is one of the most electrifying minds writing about art and artists today. You might know his name from the New York Times, the Washington Post, Artforum, or the Daily Beast, the kind of publications that don't just review art but shape the conversation around it. Blake is also the author of the monumental biography Warhol, a 900-page deep dive into the life, myth, and mechanics of America's most enigmatic artist. It's a book that doesn't just profile Andy Warhol, it reframes him, challenges the clichés, and makes you see the man behind the silver wig with totally fresh eyes. And now Blake recently finished a new book about another cultural revolutionary, Albert Barnes, the eccentric and visionary collector who built one of the greatest modern art collections in the world, then locked it away from the public like some modern-day Medici with a private gospel. Blake brings a rare combination of deep scholarship, journalistic flair, and mischievous curiosity to everything he touches. He doesn't just study artists, he understands them. He writes with a kind of intimacy that makes even the most aloof icon feel suddenly, thrillingly human. So in this episode, Blake and I dig into Rembrandt, his life, his art, and the mysteries that still swirl around him. Who was Rembrandt the man, and how should we think about the paintings that may or may not be his? And what does it tell us about how we value art, both culturally and financially? One other note. For most episodes of Is It, we reveal what the AI analysis from art recognition says about the authorship of the painting in question live during the episode, and then discuss it with a specialist from art recognition along with our star guest. But in this case, we didn't, because we already knew the outcome. In fact, I became interested in art recognition through writing a feature on Rembrandt's The Polish Rider for the art newspaper. I was so impressed that 6 months later I wound up joining art recognition in an advisory capacity. And 6 months beyond that, this podcast was born. So Blake and I, and the rest of the art world, do know the outcome of the analysis of The Polish Rider. But even without the suspense of the big reveal, which will be a component of most episodes of this podcast, we've got all sorts of interesting points to discuss. Stay tuned, you're in for something special. Blake, thanks so much for taking time to join us for this episode of Is It, the podcast. This episode is It a Rembrandt? But before we get into the painting in question, it's such a pleasure to have someone of your caliber on the show, because you are a pure rock star in the art history world. And I'd love to hear a little bit about your background for people who are familiar with your work for the Washington Post, the New York Times, your big Warhol book, which you were writing the last time that we had an event together so many years ago. But can you tell us a little bit about your background before you started writing for the Post and the Times? I know you did your PhD at Oxford. That's okay. I was at Cambridge, but we can still chat. But can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you got interested in art history?
Yeah, my background actually really is as a historian. I actually began a PhD at Oxford on 10th century Italian land contracts and decided spending the rest of my life reading 10th century Latin might not be a whole lot of fun. So I switched into Renaissance art history at Oxford, which at the time, we're talking the late 1980s, the department wasn't conservative, but the British art world was very conservative. And connoisseurship ruled absolutely still. In a way, it really doesn't anymore. That is, attribution, I think, is a small part of art history now, smaller maybe than some of your listeners will realize, and we should talk about that. But back in those days, British art history was still dominated by people who spent all their time deciding who painted what. And I have to admit that already back then, I was kind of more interested in the psychology and philosophy of art. And I had resistance to connoisseurship as a field, and you'll be hearing more about that from me in a minute. But that was my background. And then pretty soon I switched out of art history. So thank you for calling me a rock star in art history, but I haven't been really in art history for a while now. I dabble in it. I try to keep a toe in art history. But I became a critic pretty quickly, first at the Globe and Mail in Toronto, and then, as you say, at the Washington Post for a decade, and now in New York in various capacities.
So I like that this discussion is going to be about connoisseurship, as it's almost become a naughty word. But I studied for 1 year at the Corto Institute in London, which was one of the few places, that and maybe the Winterthur, where they continued to teach it. It's sort of like a parlor trick almost. This idea that you get this pseudo-mystical, pseudo-scientific vibe about authenticity. And you look at things like cross-hatching and shading and impasto, and you should just recognize the authorship of an artist in whom you've invested a huge amount of time and research, the way you might recognize, I don't know, a cousin from across a crowded room. And it's been ages since people taught that, and now it's sort of poo-pooed. Is that fair to say?
I hope so. I hope you're right that it's being poo-pooed. I mean, there are all sorts of problems with it, and we can talk about it. And the training they used to give in connoisseurship, that it was about things like hatching and the shape of ears, I think that was always window dressing. The truth is, a lot of it was purely intuitive and was based on things like the expression of the figures, the subject matter, all sorts of things that were much harder to quantify even vaguely. So as a result, people pretended that they were using more semi-scientific modes to figure out attributions. But in fact, it was always pretty nebulous and almost magical, as you said.
Now, that's been a problem for literally millennia. And yet we have these experts who are often so-called experts who weigh in with their opinion about the value of an object or who created it. And sometimes there can be a lot of money at stake. And what's always struck me as funny is there's always been a potential for conflict of interest when you're dealing with connoisseurs with an opinion that can shift the value of objects. And there's never been an objective way to determine someone's expertise as a connoisseur the way you can, like if you're a black belt in karate or a master of wine, you have to go through these objective tests and be given the stamp of approval that you know what you're talking about. And even if you have a PhD or two in art history, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can recognize an authentic hand. And yet that's been entrenched for literally hundreds of years.
Although I think that the wine comparison is not a bad one, because there's an element in wine tasting that is identification, but there's also an element of connoisseurship in a sort of more traditional sense that most people will know the word, that is understanding wine, talking about it, talking good gobbledygook about it. And so in a way, the wine world is closer to the art world than one might think, that there is all of that kind of talk, all of talk that I admire in a way, that's also involved in connoisseurship and was always involved. And you know what? I'll be saying, I think it's deeply involved in AI connoisseurship as well. And one of my problems with AI connoisseurship is that it sort of pretends that it's not involved.
I can imagine where you're going with that, but I'll be curious to hear more.
Before we even get on to that, about connoisseurship in general, it may be true that in the hallowed halls of academe, connoisseurship is no longer seen as hugely respectable, but for the general public, and especially for the art market, who painted what is still central to how people think about art. And people like me and many serious art historians worry that that is a huge distraction, that the notion of the individual genius author of artworks is something that we want to get away from, that it actually doesn't yield all that much. And connoisseurship, whether AI connoisseurship or traditional connoisseurship, is kind of built around a notion that what we should really care about before we care about anything else is who painted what and which genius, especially. And I want to get back to this in a minute, which genius painted a work. And that's all wrapped up in the market as well. So one of the reasons I'm uncomfortable with AI connoisseurship is that it has an inevitably close relationship with an art market that, you know better than anyone, is not exactly the cleanest market in the world. So I worry about giving any more attention to the art market, to connoisseurship, to anything that cares more about these things as precious objects made by geniuses, cares more about that than actually saying something interesting and important and substantial about why we should care about these objects.
Regarding sort of reevaluating authorship, of course, you're probably best known to listeners from your enormous and magnificent Warhol biography, which, if I remember, is like 900 something pages. Am I about right?
Yeah, 976, I think. Not that I've counted.
That's probably about 3 times the length of any book I've done. So that's very, very impressive. But the one that you came out with recently, and I was delighted to see how much good press you were getting, is about the Albert Barnes collection and about Barnes himself. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that book. What I'm particularly interested in, the reason I bring it in now, is I remember when the Barnes collection moved from a suburb of Philadelphia to the center, there was a reevaluation of some of the works in the collection, and particularly the old masters appeared to have been over enthusiastically attributed to famous artists, and many of them were downgraded to attributed to or school of or circle of. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that and also introduce the book.
Yeah, absolutely. For those of your readers who don't already know, Albert Barnes was a drug maker, a minor drug magnate in Philadelphia around 1910, who started collecting modern art, one of the very first people in North America to have a serious collection of modern art. And that, as you said, was in a gallery outside of Philadelphia. And in I think, 2012, it moved downtown to the center of Philadelphia. There were big lawsuits involved in that. It didn't really matter for Barnes that he had a real or El Greco or a real Tintoretto. Or I should say it didn't matter for his project, because given that he wanted to look at the ways in which El Greco and Tintoretto were forerunners of 20th century art, he only needed something extremely El Greco-ish or Tintoretto-esque to do that job. And I think that's a really valid and important idea, that works that aren't by the artist, so long as they capture in a relatively successful and profound way the achievements of that artist, do a huge amount of good for us. And it's a mistake to think that unless something is proven to be literally by the hand of the artist, which is, as you know, a problematic concept, that unless they're proven to be that, they're of no worth to us. Whereas I think that works that channel the achievement of the artist are extremely valuable and shouldn't be discounted. And that's clearly what Barnes thought. What mattered is having an El Greco-looking object that he could compare to a Picasso. Whether it was really by El Greco or not was less important for his project.
That's a fascinating idea. I also think we tend to so focus or over focus on the less than 1% of artists through history who were revolutionary or doing something hugely distinctive or culture shaping, that we tend to forget about the thousands and thousands of artists of, if we're looking only at A+ artists, of like B+ down to E- level, who still were capable of making interesting things, very beautiful things, but who didn't have the cachet or didn't begin or cultivate a high profile movement. And it's a shame to dismiss them or to assume they don't have something to offer just because they're not part of the canon of artists we think are the only ones to focus on. Could you actually give us your own introduction to the painting in question that you picked for this episode? What is it and what do you like about it?
Well, it's one of the most famous paintings pretty much in the world, certainly in America, and that's Rembrandt's Polish Rider. Fairly late Rembrandt, probably from around 1655, in the Frick collection since the early 20th century. The Frick has been redone, renovated, redecorated very recently. It's just reopened. One of the great, beautiful institutions in New York, tiny museum with a small-ish number of amazing pictures. And one of them is the Polish Rider by Rembrandt. Maybe by Rembrandt. There have been doubts sown at various different times, most famously, I think, in 1985 or so, when one of the members of the Rembrandt Research Project, was it 84? Maybe 84. One of the members of the Rembrandt Research Project, in a kind of casual way, suggested that it might be by a follower of Rembrandt, not by Rembrandt. And that set the cat among the pigeons. And there had always been some doubters about the picture, and it, of course, increased the doubts. What interests me, aside from the fact that it's a bloody beautiful, beautiful picture, is that it's quite atypical of Rembrandt. So it's a Rembrandt that looks Rembrandt-y, but not in subject matter. It's quite a strange image of a so-called Polish rider, possibly a Hungarian rider, in traditional, what should we call it? Traditional Polish cavalry attire with a bow and a couple of swords, looking very exotic astride his horse that's moving forward, that looks actually very much like an equestrian monument more than a living horse, against a kind of slightly generic mountainous background with what looks to be the sun setting behind the mountain. A lovely picture, but what interests me is that it's quite atypical of Rembrandt. And that's one of the reasons that there have been debates about it. The subject matter, the pose, even the rendering of the horse all don't look particularly typical of Rembrandt. Of course, we don't have a large data set of paintings of horses by Rembrandt, or of Polish riders for that matter. I imagine that AI might have an easier time with a Head and Shoulders portrait by Rembrandt, where there'd be a bigger data set. So that's the painting, and it brings up one or two problems I have with AI, but why don't you now talk about what AI has told us about the painting?
normally we're revealing the answers live on this show, but this is one where we already knew the answer, because this is actually, I wrote about this for the art newspaper, and that's how I got interested in AI, because of what this company, Art Recognition, had uncovered about it. And this is a happy ending, because AI can potentially undo reputations. It can potentially find lost works by famous artists. Either way, it will sort of ruffle feathers. But this is an example where it's not ruffling any feathers, because it confirmed what scholars have agreed upon, but did so in a way that was different and has the feel of something more objectively definitive and scientific than the opinion of scholars.
The feel is important to me. Sorry, Noah, for interrupting, but that notion of the feel is what concerns me.
Yeah, I can absolutely understand that. Yeah, it's a naysayer would say it's scientific-ish. I'm confident that it's firmly scientific.
Oh, it's scientific. It's absolutely scientific in the sense no one is fudging results. It uses real procedures, right? But the question is, what is it telling us, in fact?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you what it told us about this painting. And the analysis used every Rembrandt work that was in the catalog, raisonné, plus many counterexamples. And it wound up matching with what scholars have thought about it. But just to put it in context, one of the problems here is that various scholars have argued over whether it's all by Rembrandt, none of it by Rembrandt, or in part by Rembrandt. And there are aspects of it, as you mentioned, the subject matter, it's not him or his wife, Rembrandt or his wife, so it's not his favorite subject. It's very exotic as Rembrandt paintings go. It feels Rembrandt-ish, but the question is, okay, does the artist's hand, the way the colors are handled, the way the brushwork fits into place, the way people do hands and eyes and noses and ears, which are usually the telltale elements. And what it's told us is the following. So it is mostly by Rembrandt, but why were there problems? Well, we can see in the analysis, they actually create a heat map of the parts that are attributed to Rembrandt and the parts that are questionable. So many aspects of it were left unfinished, and there were minor sections that looked to have been completed by another hand at a later stage. So if we looked at the unfinished portions of the canvas, the hindquarters, legs, and tail of the horse appear to be unfinished. The rider's hands appear to be unfinished, as do areas of the landscape. Then there are some sections that were clearly completed by someone else. And one is the back of the boot and the folded back tail of the coat of the rider. Then there are aspects that have been shifted in terms of the painting's physical condition. So the right end has been cut. Rembrandt's signature has also been trimmed. You can only see an R visible on the rock at the bottom right of the painting.
But that's not from the AI. That has nothing to do with the AI,
No,
right?
That's visible. That's visible from the surface. Yeah. And a strip of 4 inches at the bottom was added to the painting, probably replacing a damaged lower part of the canvas that was removed. So what we have is the hooves and lower parts of the horse's front left and back right legs, and the ground on which those legs are standing were clearly repainted by someone else, and almost certainly a subsequent restorer. And so the uneasy way that the horse stands, which lots of people have pointed out, it just doesn't, it frankly looks awkward and doesn't look good enough to be the result of Rembrandt, were probably later inventions painting over some damaged aspect. And we do know that the painting was restored in 1833 and 1877, and it was cleaned in 1898 and in 1950. And the restorations, this is back in the days, these days they're called conservators. Back in the 19th century, they were called restorers, and some of them restored with a very enthusiastic, heavy hand that we wouldn't do today. But it means that their part of the game was to try to effectively add to paintings in such a way that you couldn't tell the difference between the original, which today one wouldn't do. But it can make it difficult with especially 19th century restorers who were over-enthusiastically applying their own brushes to canvases. So these results match what scholars have thought, but it's adding that in principle, objective analysis confirming it. And so everybody was delighted. The Frick was totally delighted. So this was an everybody's happy ending to the story, and it doesn't require rewriting history in any way. So this is an example of a seamless win for everyone through the application of AI.
But tell me something. What does it mean for the AI to confirm those findings? That is there any difference between what the AI is telling us and the simple claim that it looks like a Rembrandt? It seems to be based on other people looking at Rembrandts and deciding they're by Rembrandt. That is, it seems almost synonymous. It seems like the same thing as someone with a good eye looking at it and saying, yes, this looks like a Rembrandt. I mean, you said it was good enough to be by Rembrandt, or rather the feet weren't good enough to be by Rembrandt. Well, the sample of data that you've got, the data set, is built on, among other things, the, I think, possibly fallacious notion that better Rembrandtian pictures are by Rembrandt and worse ones aren't. So all of those kind of assumptions seem built into AI. So it seems to me as though you're going to get a situation where AI keeps spitting out what connoisseurship has always, to a certain extent, arbitrarily and certainly intuitively thought about what's by Rembrandt and what isn't. It seems to me the claim that my saying it looks like a Rembrandt except for the hooves is really the same thing as the heat map that AI generates. I'm not clear that there's a huge difference between the claim that something looks like a Rembrandt and the claim being made by the AI, which is really the same claim. This bit looks like Rembrandt, that bit doesn't.
That's a totally fair point of debate. And I would say that you're right in principle, but what the AI is doing is it's building, the data set is built on the inclusion of every work that the current catalog raisonné has attributed to the artist. And why is that useful? Well, human scholars, if you're a specialist in Rembrandt, you will be familiar with the catalog raisonné, but we also have inherent hypothesis bias that a computer program shouldn't have, unless it's programmed to do so, of course, which this isn't. And the idea that the current catalog raisonné, because there have been so many for any artists who have been of note for long enough, will have brought into account not just the vibe, the connoisseurship, but the opinion of many different scholars, because catalog raisonné these days are more often made by teams rather than individuals. And then it mitigates the possibility that there's an individual bias at play, plus provenance research, plus, here and there when it's possible, forensics. So it's essentially, we might even call it like a super connoisseur.
Mm-hmm.
If that doesn't make you itch if I say that. But I take your point entirely. I feel like this is just hopefully the ultimate connoisseur being fed all the knowledge. It's like, if you remember the film The Matrix, where Neo can have expertise in kung fu uploaded to him, and then he wakes up and he says, I know kung fu. And this is like the Neo version of a connoisseur without the potential for bias, because he doesn't have a horse in the game.
Yes, I think that's a really good model. In a way, it's like a kind of human super connoisseur. It doesn't even need the computer stage in it. If someone could really digest, all of the catalog raisonnés and all the counterexamples, et cetera, if a connoisseur could do that, they'd spew out results rather like the AI, with all the biases that connoisseurship have in them. That is, the AI doesn't remove the biases that connoisseurship inherently has towards quality, against unusual subject matter. There are all sorts of built-in problems and biases in connoisseurship. The AI can't get rid of those because it's based on connoisseurship. What it can do, usefully, it seems to me, is just absorb the entire canon of extant connoisseurship and make a good judgment based on that, which is very much what a superb connoisseur is supposed to do, right? That's already what a good connoisseur is supposed to do. And it seems to me that AI can just be a better version of that, but without getting rid of fundamental problems that are there in connoisseurship already.
That's exactly right. I think that's a perfect way to summarize it. And then what we're working on now, which would make it even more intriguing, is if we can include analysis of multispectral imagery when
Right.
that's available, and hopefully that will ever be available for more works of art, then that really takes it to another level. Because all of a sudden, if you can compare the infrared spectrogram of every work that has been viewed with infrared light by an artist in question, and then also look at that next to a new work, then that takes it to a whole level of depth, literally and metaphorically, that would really level things up.
Yeah, I mean, one central problem, though, and this is why I chose the Polish writer actually, is that a central element, as I think we talked about a few minutes ago, central element in connoisseurship has always been subject matter, has always been expression. Those are things that AI actually can't deal with, or certainly not yet. And those might indicate that something isn't by an artist, even if the so-called hand of the artist seems to be present. That is, the AI seems to privilege a notion of the hand that's really been questioned in all sorts of different ways in art history today. But it seems very much reliant on those kind of details. That is, the micro details of how something is painted. And it ignores larger details, let's call them semantic details, which should be just as important to connoisseurship. So imagine that, and this is obviously completely caricatural, imagine that we get a painting of Mickey Mouse in an absolutely perfect Rembrandtian style, right?
I would like that on my wall.
I think that that connoisseur would pretty soon decide that it probably wasn't by Rembrandt, and yet I know this is just a silly caricature, but and yet the AI would be fooled entirely because of its preference for the hand over anything else.
Yeah, I would hope it wouldn't, because I see your point entirely, but I hope it wouldn't, because it would understand how Rembrandt handled noses, ears, mouths. And if one looked more mouse-like,
Right.
I think it depends how crazy you're getting. But for example, if you
Well, let's change the subject and say that it's Donald Trump. Let's say it's a portrait of Donald Trump, right?
Okay,
I don't think Rembrandt painted a portrait of Donald Trump. I wouldn't want to put too much money on that, but I've got a feeling he never did. But there you have a case where the hand would trump a really obvious tell that the thing wasn't by Rembrandt.
it is a potential Achilles heel. That said, for many artists, they have stylized faces that they'll use for non-portrait figures, like every Raphael, Perugino, or Pinturicchio holy figure looks more or less the same. Or if you have a Botticelli data set in AI, then they're gonna expect to find Simonetta Vespucci's face in some of the paintings, but his main model. And if the model looks so different, it would be good to know if they can flag content that is questionable. But that's a really interesting point, because they are looking, it's one of those things, they're looking at trees, not necessarily the forest. But the optimal AIs will be looking at both. But that's a very good point you made.
And that may yet happen. I mean, AI is progressing at such speed, and there are AIs that are getting better at semantics than they used to be. It seems to me one of the risks with AI connoisseurship is that it doesn't leave room for artists to make extremely eccentric works that don't fit with their canon. It's a premise of AI that artists will mostly do things that are recognizably by the artist. So an obvious example from the 20th century is when an artist who's mostly an abstractionist also makes works that aren't, like Ellsworth Kelly, who mostly makes extremely simplified, minimal paintings, which of course I think AI could not tell from a follower who did almost exactly the same thing. But then he does leaf drawings as well, drawings of plants. Yeah. And I want to imagine that artists of all periods might do that. Now, traditional connoisseurship has the same problem. It has a big problem with artists doing things that are either much weaker than we imagine they could do, or wildly different from what they would normally do, or that they paint with their left hand on Wednesdays and the rest of the week they paint with their right hand. That is, it tends to homogenize what an artist might do and doesn't leave room, almost definitionally, for artists doing things that look and feel and are entirely different from what they normally do. Now, it may be that artists don't do that very often, but we sort of decided that artists don't do it because of the premises that we build connoisseurship on. So that's one of my worries about all connoisseurship, and AI connoisseurship in particular, that it biases towards works that are within the style of the artist by the artist, and away from the possibility that artists do things sometimes which are very tangential to their normal work.
That's entirely reasonable. I think that the only thing I would say is, if an artist has a period, let's say Picasso's various periods, where there are enough works in a certain style that they can be part of the data set as, keep an eye out for this. You're telling the AI because this is one of the styles that the artist did, then that can work. Or like Mondrian's more realistic trees before he goes into his Broadway boogie woogie abstraction. But if there's a random one here and there, you're right, that would be a place where it could slip through the netting with human connoisseurs as with AI. And I think you're absolutely right that we need the human connoisseurs in order to build the AI data set. So the mistakes that they make, hopefully we're going to avoid because we're dealing with, catalogs raisonné. But, somebody has to put the data set together and has to decide what data the AI is going to be using. And so you have to be very careful about it. It has to be carefully curated. And there are potential for things to fall through. And then there are firms that are doing basically a half-assed job. And that is bad for everything, especially for the use of AI in this context, because it will make people lose faith in it because they're basically not treating it as seriously as they should. So these are all totally valid points. And we're early enough in the world of AI in all fields, really, because it's now, pervasive, that there's a lot of, it remains to be seen, but let's be optimistic about it.
Yeah, I think it has huge potential. I think the potential risks hiding the risks, no matter how much an AI provider says, well, these are our best guesses using AI. I've got a feeling because of the scientism attached to it, the real science attached to it, it's going to seem much more certain than it actually is. And the fact that it's built on human error will be ignored by a lot of people.
Yeah, I could imagine that. It's like with the introduction of DNA tests to legal cases, it sounds so compelling that it has the potential to influence decisions without people, double checking to see is it indeed match with all the other aspects of the case, which is why it needs to be considered as part of the whole, the attributional whole, with all of the different categories we talked about. But also you make the legitimate point, people want to know who an author is, but from the perspective of us as people who are public-facing art analysts and professionals, we would like people to look at the picture and not overly focus on the name behind it. That's another aspect of this that you brought up that I hadn't thought of in this context, but it's totally right on.
Of course, as a biographer, I make some of my living by concentrating on the people behind works of art. So allow me that internal contradiction, if you don't mind.
Fair enough. Blake, this is a total delight. You're awesome. I'm a member of your fan club. And thank you again for taking time off to chat with me about this.
Oh, not at all, Noah. You do this brilliantly well. It's been a total pleasure. You're really, really good at it.
So the verdict is in, and Rembrandt's The Polish Rider is in fact mostly by Rembrandt, but with several interventions by restorers that muddied the waters. But this is a very happy ending when the leading specialists precisely agree with the leading AI image analysis. Thanks for listening to Is It? The Podcast. This series is produced by Urshka Charney, presented by Noah Charney, and is brought to you by Art Recognition. Based in Zurich, Art Recognition is the leading firm for AI-driven authentication of artworks. Featured everywhere from the art newspaper to Wired to The Guardian and beyond, Art Recognition uses the most definitive, sophisticated datasets and advanced processes to estimate the likelihood that a specific artist created an artwork. Backed by a multidisciplinary team that takes many dimensions of research into consideration, Art Recognition has a long track record of success at the highest level. Learn more at art-recognition.com. That's art-recognition.com. We'll be back next time with a new art historical mystery, a new possible artist behind the masterpiece, and a new guest expert. See you next time.